The following program is presented by the Metropolitan Library Service Agency.
Hello, welcome to All About Kids, a program focusing on the interests of children and young people and some of the issues affecting them. Our topic today is the effects of the media on children and their families. Our guests are Dr. Ed Ehlinger of Boynton Health Service, the University of Minnesota, Dr. Marti Erickson, Executive Director of the Consortium for Children, Youth, and Families at the University of Minnesota, and Chuck Slocum, Executive Director of Metro Cable Network. Ed, Marty, and Chuck, it's a pleasure to have you here today on All About Kids, and I think that we're here because we share a common interest. We're all very interested in television, and we're real aware of some of the concerns and the current research about the impact television has on children and families. And the three of you have been doing quite a bit, each in your own profession, to focus on how families and children can learn critical viewing skills, and also how parents can use TV effectively with their children. Ed, you and Marty are just back from Vice President Al Gore's family reunion, and the whole focus of that symposium or big conference this year was on the impact of media on families.
Yes, and it was an interesting conference for me, coming as a participant. I know Marty was there. She coordinated the whole thing and developed the program. So it was fun for me to come and see all of the people who were interested in television, and a lot of people looking at TV as a real opportunity to educate kids. But also a lot of people recognizing that it really has some problems inherent in it, particularly in terms of the violence, the sexual activity that goes on television, a lot of things related to body image. And as we talked more and more about some of the problems, we almost got to the point where it was overwhelming, the number of problems. But behind all of that was the idea that, boy, there really is something positive that we can do about it. It's a powerful tool. It really has an impact on kids. And if it can impact kids in a negative way, it can also impact kids in a very positive way. And I think that was the challenge that I got from that conference is, okay, now how do we use this really powerful tool that's going to become increasingly powerful as we start looking at computers and video screens coming into your homes in various interactive mechanisms. It's going to be a real challenge for us, but I'm really excited that there's some really powerful things that we can do to educate and help kids.
Marty, why did the Vice President choose this as the theme of his conference? We know that certainly his wife has been involved in some issues involving music and the media.
Well, Vice President Gore has been doing annual family policy conferences now for 4 years, and the theme has been different each year, but he's always very carefully listening to what participants say about the issues that are really burning for them. And this was an issue that had come up repeatedly in the previous 3 conferences. So he was hearing a lot of people say this is something we really have to look at. You know, obviously we have to look at what we can do in our communities to build strong networks for children, and we need to look at all sorts of factors that influence kids' development and that help families be strong. But media are so powerful, and the television in particular is such a part of the family system. You know, almost every family in America has at least one TV, and it's very much a part of how we live our lives. So that was an issue that was brought up over and over again, and he responded to that, and of course referring back to the wonderful work that Tipper did a number of years ago, work that was often misinterpreted and kind of challenged in some ways that were not always real well founded.
Well, Chuck, I think that ties exactly what you as the Executive Director of Metro Cable Network are interested in. Not only, you are the media, the powerful media that Marty was referring to, but you're also, you're very interested in what's happening to children in our community as a volunteer with the Children's Defense Fund. You're a volunteer with the YMCA, a Sunday school teacher, and you're working with a group of other media types, other cable producers.
Well, yeah, cable people and the community are trying to play a role in what the Vice President has stimulated this debate. in healthy television choices. And one of the themes of our Critical Choices Forum here in Minnesota is basically parents do have a right to play a role in what their kids watch. The research in this area is phenomenal. And my family's no different than anybody else's. I'm sure that the average television is on in America 10 hours a day. That's a lot. And in some homes, much more than that. In other homes, of course, nothing. But 10 hours a day. And so it is a powerful, powerful instrument. There are more televisions in America, by far, more television households in America than there are anything else, including telephones. So one of the solutions we're finding is all about kids. Healthy television programming that deals with issues that parents and children must address is really in short supply. In the early 50s, the networks really made a concerted effort. I think because, in fact, children's programming is relatively cheap compared to the other kinds. And so there was, in an average week on network television, there was nearly 30 hours of children's programming. So if you had the TV on and kids were watching it, chances are during the day they were getting some pretty healthy stuff, and we still have the remnants of some of that great program. Today, that 30 hours is down to less than 2 hours a week of children's programming. Now, that doesn't include cable. It doesn't include All About Kids. You've been on 7 or 8 years, over 200 episodes. Channel 6 has been proud to be your partner in that. We need more of this kind of intelligent, thoughtful dialogue.
Well, it is a way, and I think you've all been talking about a way of not only having just the programming, but having interactive kinds of things so that the studio or the audience who's watching the program can call in. Ed is the producer and host of Public Health Journal. You're talking about that. And Marti, you're doing clips on Channel 11 where parents with questions can call in. And these kinds of things are alternatives to some of the more inflammatory kinds of programming where people obviously want to express an opinion, but this is a little bit more moderate, I think.
Well, I think what Chuck is doing with Channel 6 is the kind of model that needs to be played out a lot more, and public television in general. One of the things that I've discovered in watching television is that broadcast media is there to bring people to an advertiser, that they're there solely to sell products. That's the main purpose, whereas public television and public access television is there more for the educational focus. And I think we really need to support that kind of community-based, community service television programming that really is in short supply right now. And it is being threatened in many ways.
Do you think there's a stereotype that educational programming or cable programming is boring, that some people don't watch? It interests me because I think people who are channel surfers, and everyone who has a remote control obviously are bored in many cases with the options on network TV. And if they're intrigued by a topic, they'll stop and they'll listen and they'll perhaps think about it. Do you find that, Chuck, response from the community?
Channel 6 has a remarkably attractive channel location here in the 7-county metro area, and we do get sometimes up to 40% of the viewers, and they're surfing. I mean, we're not able to
promote. And you're right before the sports channel, aren't you? So.
Yeah, well, no, we're not. Depends on what system you're on. In my system, we're not right before the sports channel. That's Channel 12 in my system. But your point is, I think, is a good one. The discerning viewer often is willing to surf now with so many choices. They're willing to look. And we think on Channel 6 we frequently offer the best thing on television. And we clearly aren't the best marketed, and we don't have the highest priced productions. But when it comes to important content, of course, community television is different than public television. We're kind of the cable's public television is community television. And we offer lots and lots of choices. We have about 1,000 hours a year of religious programming of all kinds. We wish that we had that many hours of children's programming. That's why this particular program has been a lead program in our community and community TV. Learning all about kids from adults learning all about kids really is what your focus has been, isn't it, Gretchen?
Well, the idea of focusing on issues affecting children and families, and both Marti and Ed have been guests before. Marti talking about the activities of the Consortium, and one of the Consortium's primary purposes, I think, is to make research accessible to the community. And if the community doesn't know what the university is doing, how can that research become accessible? So this is just one more way. And of course, Ed has focused on a variety of kinds of things. And what has always interested me about Ed's connection with health is the very broadness of it. I remember one of the first conversations we had when you emphasized that a family that reads is a healthy family, and equating good reading and good educational habits with good physical and mental health, I think is...
Well, and that's why I'm glad you asked me here today, because I have a question for you, is that, as we talk about literacy in reading stories, reading things to your child, you're teaching them how to discern literature that is really helpful to them. But we're still in the early stages of how to teach kids how to discern good television, and families how to discern television. Is there something that you've learned in the literary field that we can use in the media field to help families say, this is how you choose a good program, this is how you use television to educate your child and your family?
Well, one of the things I think when an adult is using a book with a child, it takes that interaction, two people doing it together, the parent and the child, or the caregiver and the child, and that's a very warm, reassuring kind of thing. Too often, I think adults find television an alternative for sitting down with a child, and that's where the discerning adult who sits down with a child, and it doesn't need to be, as we were laughing before, you can't do it all the time, but I think basically if you're sitting there initially with a child, what good is Sesame Street, for instance, if a parent isn't reinforcing the learning of the alphabet or the counting of the numbers? We worry about exposing older children, junior high school students, or even younger children to some of the other violent programs, even the news. But I think a parent or another adult who's sitting there and says to the child, do you really believe that this could happen? Or how does this differ from the choice that this kid made, differ from the way we're talking about things in our family? Those are some of the things that perhaps as a librarian and also a parent, I would suggest for critical TV viewing.
Mm-hmm. Well, Gretchen, I think you're really pointing to the factor that comes through most strongly in all the research on the impact of media violence on children. And the discussion about media and kids has often stayed at that focus, just looking at the impact of violence on children, and I think we need to really broaden the way we think about that and look at all the different ways that television and other media influence children. But there is a large body of research on the impact of media violence on kids, and the major factor that comes through is that how parents mediate that violence is really the critical variable in determining what the impact is. Now, it's not to say that media violence is ever a good thing for children, but certainly when kids see violent things on television, if there's a parent or an adult sitting down with them and doing just the kind of talking that you're suggesting, that can really mediate the negative effect. So we've got a real job to do, I think, to help parents understand, first of all, the impact of media on their children's development, and secondly, the critical role that they can play in mediating that effect.
Is one of the things you brought up, Chuck, was the parents saying, I can do this. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes it's just so exhausting. Everybody is watching a certain program, or everybody has a show, and if you're the only parent on the blocks that says, no, you're not going to watch that, your child sulks and storms, and it's like any other.
Sure.
And they go next door and watch it on
watch
someone
it anyway,
else's TV.
exactly.
But you've still made the point about your principle.
One of the things that research, Marty, maybe you can affirm this, but I recall reading research in youth parenting and in youth mentoring, that kids at even a phenomenally late age, even as late as 16 to 18, really are asking for boundaries. They're asking for a definition of what are the values, what are the rules here within our house. And though there may be tremendous friction, and there may be a lot of testing of those boundaries, that kids really do want and deserve that. The federal government likely will be taking action on this parental choice, parental rights with television in the new telecommunications legislation. There's technology now that allows programming to be blocked out. And if there is a channel that's coming into a home, invading a home in a way, a negative one, or the parents think it is, there's a way to block that out. Either block it out entirely or block it out at certain times of the day. That's called the V-chip, and likely that will be in both the House and Senate bill, and President Clinton will likely sign that sometime this year, sometime in 1995.
Was that something that came up in your discussions?
Yes, it was.
In Tennessee, was there any? What about First Amendment or free speech or those kinds of things, or children's access to information? Did that come up as an issue?
Well, certainly the First Amendment issue came up over and over again in the conference as a whole, but I felt that there was general consensus that the V-chip really is just giving parents choice, that it really is not censorship. Those signals are still going out, and people who choose to watch those things in their home can, but that it's giving parents some appropriate
Just as we in the
what their
library say
children
it is the
see.
parent's
In
responsibility.
fact,
to
it's
guide.
more affirming of the First Amendment because parents do have some rights of their own to,
That's right.
to choose what they and their children are going to watch.
And you've worked with children and families for a long, long time. Do you see children in a different way now? Are they more sophisticated? Are they aware of more things? And do you think that that's because of the media? Or
Well, I want to get back to related to that and what Marty had said earlier about the influence of media violence on families. Also, I think the reverse is true, that societal violence is affecting children's use of the media. As I've worked in the inner city, working in a pediatric population, I've seen more and more families keep their kids from going outside to physically exercise or to use the parks, to use community resources because of the fear of violence. So that more and more kids are staying in the house. And what do you do when you're in a low-income neighborhood? You don't have a lot of resources. You don't have a family that reads a lot. You don't have any options. You watch television. And that's when the interaction between the violence and the community forces kids to watch television. And then if television reinforces the violence, I think they're getting a view of the world that this is a really hostile place.
and very frightening. Do you think children are more frightened?
And children in general, I think, are much more fearful. As I've seen it over the last 20 years, children are much more fearful of the world with which they have to interact. And I think that has some major implications for all sorts of things: personal interactions, physical exercise, societal responsibility. And I've seen that changed, and particularly in the inner city, in a way that is detrimental to the families and to the community in which they live.
You know, one of the things that child care providers are noticing lately is the increased kind of sexual acting out among very young children, and often with a lot of aggressiveness in it, so that they're seeing children enact rape scenes, really. And I think that we have to think very carefully about the kinds of images of relationships and of sexuality that our children are getting from television, too. And this is really showing up just in the sorts of things that a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old does in their play.
Do you think that's because parents simply are oblivious to the fact that small children are picking up all these innuendos that they don't understand?
Well, I think
But-
it's easy to let the television be a babysitter, and I understand that as a busy parent myself. I understand that that's the easy way sometimes, and so I think it's partly convenience and therefore not paying real careful attention to what our children see. But I think we also, as a society, have become kind of desensitized. You know, we're used to being bombarded with images of violence and sex and craziness. You watch the daytime talk shows on the networks, for example, and you know what a series of aberrations. And I think we have really let poor television kind of define our culture and desensitize all of us. And I just think we need to wake up and look at what's there and figure out what we can do about it.
A goal we have at Channel 6 is to provide really real alternatives. All of our programs deal with this community, produced by and for people of our 7-county community. And boy, I could venture predict if we had that V-chip, or if parents could sit there with the on and off button any given time, in 9,000 hours a year nearly of programming that we do, you're not going to find any kind of programming that's going to be detrimental to kids. Now, that's a fairly unique niche, but our whole mission is to bring this community and to be a mirror of sorts to the community, back to the community. So I always tell kids when I talk to them about Channel 6 that, you know, you may be quite bored with some of our programming, but you're never going to be violated. It's never going to really do you any damage if you watch and learn about where we all live and work here.
When you talked about the narrowcasting, and I think the more people have alternatives to things that are on network TV, the more interested they get. Public policy issues, for instance, you can become really a junkie, or health issues, or just the fact that there is a whole different world out there, and it's focused on what's going on in Minnesota.
Well, I mean, I think the advent of these 500 channels coming into people's homes, it can be positive in that it can reflect the diversity of families right now throughout our society. Different families have different structures, they have different interests, different areas of expertise, And if they have a chance to choose actively among a variety of channels that really meet their needs, I think they will be better for it. So I think this number of channels, modified, or having families be able to pick and choose which ones they want, can be really healthy and positive.
And it's like the publishing world. The more that's available, the more you have to choose from, the more competition, therefore the higher quality you hope. So
You bet. I think we ought to look, in the next decade, I think a resolve of our country ought to be to turn around a cynical public. When asked recently, the public was asked about whether television was a positive or a negative influence on the values of their family. 80% of the people agreed it was a negative.
but yet they're all watching it day after day,
yeah.
night after night.
And there are many, many positives, and I think with selective viewing and with improved programming and with a concerted public will, we can 10 years from now say 80% of the folks can say television has really been a positive, a good in shaping a better society for us. And we're all pretty cynical about a lot of things, and I think that's kind of reflected in how we look at television and everything else. And I think the potential, I think Ed was right, the upside potential of television as a force in our society is remarkable.
I mean, the question of if it's a positive or negative influence is probably not the question. The question is it an influence? And I think without a doubt, television is an influence on families, and our job is to make it a positive influence.
Exactly.
And then how to evaluate that over the course of the year so that we can say, yes, we're making progress to make it more and more positive.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's so many different points of action for doing that. We have to look at what we do in our own families. We have to find that consistency between our public statements and our private statements in our own homes. But we also need to look at how we can organize together and really put pressure on the people who sponsor commercial programming, for example. I don't think we can stop at just saying this is what we're going to do in our own homes and giving people free choices through public television and so on. Those are very important things. But I think we also really need to be a strong collective voice, speaking to the people who are putting on a lot of the commercial programming and speaking to both the sponsors and the producers of those programs.
Were there any recommendations or any firm commitments from people who attended this symposium?
Well, I think there was a strong commitment from many of the participants. How strong the commitment is from people within the industry, and particularly the part of the industry that is so market-driven, I'm not sure yet. I think we really have some work to do. There were some key people from within commercial television who were involved both in the planning of the conference and who did participate at the conference. Some kind of bright lights within the industry who understand that they need to be more responsible, that they need to recognize their opportunity. But that they also have to deal with the reality of making a profit. You know, it is a business, and that's a real challenge.
Well, you talked about the market-driven. What about the current concern that public television will not be funded at the same levels by the government, and there'll have to be more private fundraising? And what will that do to the quality of the programming that's currently available? Chuck, you know, it's a little
Well, that's I think the
MCPN,
expectation
but
is fair that we're going to have a realignment of the way we fund our institutions, and the public sector is not going to be able to do as much as it's done in the past, particularly in what are judged to be marginal areas. I think the investment we make in the arts and in public TV, public radio are healthy investments in the main. I'm part of that, but we have to reconfigure this. I think the private sector community has to see it's in our best interest to be a part of these healthy programming options. And I think that the prospects of that happening are pretty high. That they're going to see that we're going to win more customers for our goods and services if we're a part of underwriting and funding good things like All About Kids.
Thank you.
Well, I'm somewhat disturbed at the lack of public funding for public television, because I'm starting to see some changes in programming in both in public television and public radio, more towards marketing as opposed to good programming. And I've seen commercials on public television by the major sponsors. So it's starting to look more and more like commercial television, because they need to gather that market in order to get some donations or get funding. So I'm concerned that if we lose the funding for public television and public radio, we're going to have the public radio and television closer and closer to broadcast commercial television.
And the risk in that, I think, was really articulated well by some of the media people and the advertising people who participated in the conference at Nashville. They talked about not only the need to attract X number of viewers to sell their products, but that they need to really attract a certain segment of the audience. For example, much of the commercial programming is aimed at 18 to 49-year-old males because they're the ones who are spending the most money and these products that are aimed at them. So I think that issue of market segmentation and what that does to the kind of programming that's on the air is something to really reckon with. And I share Ed's concern about public television falling into that trap. We need something that's not driven by those kinds of market forces.
What do you think is going to happen to MCN?
Well, MCN is going to be a keeper. We're a privately funded nonprofit organization with lots of contributions from the cable industry. It's a model that hasn't been duplicated anywhere else in the country, in that we go to every household that has cable, about half of them in the Twin City area, 24 hours a day on Channel 6. And I think that we have to focus more. I think two of the areas we ought to focus more on are young people and youth sports. I think that will bring an increasing number of viewers to us. We have to aggressively recruit and find capable programmers and help them get on the air and bring this programming to the community. But I'm optimistic that just as I think we can sort out new and more positive rules for operating our television media, both broadcast and cable and all the other kinds, and public, I'm optimistic that 6 can kind of feel the way. There is a need. We find that lots of people find us on that dial, even though we aren't on the billboards and aren't in the journals.
Well, public journalism is a term that's becoming rather in vogue, and I think that Cable 6 really offers an opportunity for public journalism where people can not only be involved in the production, but also focusing in a very grassroots way, bring people back to government as well as citizenship, all those responsible kinds of things.
And
that
about
we're
a third of our
for.
programming is focused in that general area right now, in citizenship and understanding how our government works. But we have also needs to do a better job with kids and families and providing instructive and useful information. And I guess I have a lot of confidence that the broad onwash public aren't a bunch of cattle. They really are discerning and capable. And
they're waiting for an alternative.
Yeah, and I think since 1987 or so, Channel 6 has been a very interesting alternative for cable users in providing interesting and good programming. And I think that as we evolve into kind of a lot more narrowcasting, I think we're going to find maybe a lot more channels succeeding that are going to have overwhelmingly positive influences on the viewers.
And Ed, you'll continue this kind of focus with Public Health Journal, which also airs on Regional Cable 6, won't
Yes,
you?
well, we'll be continuing with that, and we will be working with you and people like yourself to try to develop the literacy in all areas that families need to grow. They need to have literacy in vision, what they watch, literacy in what they hear, literacy in what they do, literacy in what they think. So I think we're going to work in all of those areas.
What a magnificent conclusion to a discussion that just touched the tip of the iceberg. Thank you all for being with us today on All About Kids.
Thanks for asking me.
Thank you.
Our guests today spoke with authority expertise from their position as child advocates on the effect of media on children and families. Thank you, Ed Ehlinger, Marti Erickson, and Chuck Slocum. Thanks to all of you for joining us on All About Kids. Please tune in again.
This has been a presentation of Hennepin County Library in conjunction with the Twin Cities Metropolitan Library Service Agency.